Welcome to another special edition of Daily Airline News focusing on the search for MH370. I'm Jeffrey Thomas, delighted to say, joined by my co-host Richard Godfrey. Good morning, Richard.
And good afternoon, Jeffrey.
And by the way, there's some people who want a t-shirt which says that, so we have to look at that. Um, so
We should put the balloon on the t-shirt too.
as well, yes, yes. Now down to some serious business. We're focusing on the episode we did on the 10 things we know about MH370 and the captain. But we've been overwhelmed with questions, and this is the second session we're doing answering those questions. And it's also provoked some other questions which we're going to address as well, which are really quite fascinating. The first, there's two of them here. Charles Toast 4051. What veracity is there in the story of workers from a microchip manufacturer traveling on MH370 with their families, suggesting a defection, taking classified information to China? Could this have been enough for the US security services to hijack the plane remotely? The other one was from Tim Brab. Is it true 42 Chinese technicians were on board and connected to a microchipped patent? Now, those two questions, Richard, have surfaced over and over again, but you've done some work on this one.
Yeah, so the employees of Freescale Semiconductors, a global company, were on MH370 and flying from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. In total, there were 20 employees. 12 were Malaysian nationals, and 8 were Chinese nationals. And Freescale Semiconductor has manufacturing facilities and research facilities in both countries, both in Malaysia and in China, and in many other countries too. And this was a perfectly normal business trip between two of their facilities with employees from both of those facilities. There is, in my view, nothing nefarious about this business trip, but it was a tragedy for the company to lose 20 employees, as you can imagine, in one aircraft accident.
Mm. There's been an enormous amount of coverage of that, hasn't there, over the years?
Yeah, and it's true that there are patents held by Freescale Semiconductors. It's true that they were involved in a number of commercial and civilian, but also a number of military projects. It is true that those patents were valuable information, but there's nothing that has come out so far that proves that there was some plot involving the Freescale Semiconductor employees that was in any way nefarious.
Mm. Okay, so Andy Beckett, 4480. You mentioned the Texas A&M conclusion that the aircraft entered the water in a near vertical dive. Could their evidence be consistent with a failed ditching which became a cartwheel?
Well, you would, of course, get considerable damage from a failed ditching and a cartwheeling of the aircraft. But the Texas A&M study was not compatible, in my view, with a failed attempt at a ditching. It was much more compatible with a nose down dive into the ocean from 40,000 feet down to the surface. So, yeah, I think the A&M study does support those who are of the view that this was not an attempted ditching.
Martip 1 Whiskey 1 Uniform. Thank you, Richard and Jeffrey, for your ongoing investigation into MH370. I was wondering whether, when the FDR is recovered, will it provide a definitive proof of an active pilot until impact? Would you please confirm what I think you indicated on a previous episode, that the FDR and CVR cannot be disabled from the cockpit?
Yeah, the FDR and cockpit voice recorder cannot be disabled from the cockpit. The FDR does record over 1,000 flight parameters during the entire flight. So it will tell us exactly if there was an active pilot up until the end, and it will tell us any inputs that the aircraft received from an active pilot, including whether the autopilot was switched off or not, whether there were any manual flight control inputs. So we will learn a lot if the FDR can be found.
Great. Wings 6499. Thank you for your careful analysis. Refreshing to hear cool, objective research so well presented. Forgive me if this has been asked before, but you suggested that the short time between last transmission and turn ruled out a hijacking. What evidence is there that the last words transmitted by the captain were not spoken under duress of, for example, a hijacker or a disaffected member of the crew?
Yeah, what I said is it didn't rule it out, it made it highly unlikely, the fine difference. Now, the cockpit voice recordings were analyzed by a professional voice analyst, a Professor Dr. Hermann J. Kunzel from the Marburg University in Germany. And he flew to Malaysia and spent 5 days there analyzing various recordings, also previous recordings of both the captain and the co-pilot. They also asked family members and friends who would have recognized voices and voice patterns. There is no evidence from the analysis by Professor Dr. Hermann Kunzel that there was any words spoken under duress, and either by a hijacker or a disaffected member of the crew. So unfortunately, we have to conclude that it is highly likely it was not a hijacking.
Yeah. Jim Haram, thank you both for your insights. I agree most of the causes of the flight can be ruled out, but just for the sake of asking, after the pilot made his last communication, 66 seconds later the flight turned around. We know that this was a manual turn and not an instrument turn. Is there any scenario on the last turn due south that autopilot was engaged between those two turns? I highly doubt it, but just running through the flight in my head, if something could have happened, lost communication, pilot turned around, maybe plotted a return course to airport, and pilot lost the ability to fly the aircraft.
Yeah, so what do we know for sure, Jim? We know for sure the aircraft carried on for 7 hours, 37 minutes in total. We know that there was a turn at the diversion, a turn around Penang Island. That's recorded on civilian primary radar. And although it hasn't been released, it is also apparently recorded on military primary radar. We know from the Inmarsat satellite data a turn was made into the Indian Ocean, and further turns were recorded by the Whisper data. Aircraft don't reprogram their flight management system by themselves. And perhaps I yesterday was misleading when I said you can program waypoints, but you can't change altitude or change speed. Well, you can limit an altitude and limit speed with entries into the flight management. But to put all of those entries in and all of those turns and changes of altitude and changes of speed would be quite a substantial job. What you cannot do from the flight management system and programming in advance, you can't extend the landing gear. You can't extend flaps for an attempted ditching. So there is a limit to what you can program in advance on the flight management system. And we believe there was an active pilot right until the end. We do not know whether the landing gear was extended. There is evidence the flaps were not extended, which is surprising. If you're trying to do a ditching, you should extend at least partially the flaps. So I think the jury is still out until we find the flight data recorder, which will tell us in detail what happened.
Lulabelle Gnostic, 8402. When you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, lovely quote from the Sherlock Holmes books by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And I completely agree. The power of deduction by elimination, we called it yesterday. And we have ruled out 99% of the possible causes. So what we're left with may be not palatable to some and may seem highly improbable to others, but there you go.
Keith Malgren. Words may be chosen well or poorly, and Mr. Godfrey, I must say that your choice of the word speculative was well made to such a degree that it might better classify it as having been artfully done. On another note, this video is one of the many of yours, thank you for them, wherein a lack of government eagerness to assist is notable to say the least. In this case, the fact that the French government is unwilling to share a few barnacles for analysis. There are so many examples of various governments finding themselves unable or unwilling to lift a finger to assist with MH370 that I can't help wondering if it is willful. While I'm always suspicious of any kind of conspiracy theory, as I find they are virtually always nonsense, it is extremely odd that there are so many examples, seen repeatedly in your videos and others, of governments who seem unwilling to take steps that would normally be expected in such an investigation.
Yeah, well, that's a long questions and comment set. One point you raised about the French government being unwilling to share a few barnacles. Well, not quite true. They did share barnacles with, for example, a professor from Australia who is an expert in barnacles, and he analyzed using laser beams the barnacles that he received. There was a French expert on barnacles who already analyzed. So we have different analyses, and there have been others since who also have come up with clever ideas and analyses for barnacles. So, yeah, the French could have spared a few more barnacles for experts from Florida or other universities, University of Kuwait, for example. but they didn't. Now, in general, we have tried to present evidence of the possibility that there is more information out there from a number of countries that is not in the public domain. In some cases, we have shared factual information that information was still being withheld. For example, the data recovered by the FBI from the home flight simulator of Captain Zahari Shah, we know the full data format in Microsoft Flight Simulator versions that were used and the add-ons that were used for the Boeing 777. We have asked about certain data fields that were missing and been given more data. And we've asked again, when we've had that data, about other data that is still missing. And we have been told we can confirm your inference is correct, but we cannot give out the data. So there's still more data there which could be shared. I have a large amount of data which was only released to me and sometimes also to other independent investigators under various non-disclosure agreements. I've signed 5 NDAs in relation to MH370. There has been a significant amount of information that has been leaked. So when it's leaked, you have to be very careful to check the source and the validity of any leaked data. You never know, there might be someone who's got a hidden agenda in leaking misinformation. So I may appear to choose my words carefully and differentiate between proven fact or opinion or speculation, but I can assure you I'm not trying to be artful or sly or cunning or tricky. We're just trying to be careful.
Careful and also very respectful, Richard, as well.
Yeah.
AI NI 260. If the pilot had control all the while, does it mean he had enough oxygen to breathe on till then? And can you confirm the amount which is available in the plane? And did the pilot pre-plan to have his oxygen supply topped up, I presume?
Yeah, the flight crew oxygen top up is a standard procedure because a certain amount of oxygen gets used on each flight. The pilot and the co-pilot have to uh, test their emergency oxygen mask before takeoff, and a little bit of oxygen will be used in each test on each flight. So the Boeing 777 flight crew oxygen system typically includes 1 or 2 high pressure oxygen cylinders. Each cylinder holds approximately 3,150 liters of oxygen at a pressure of 1,850 psi. One cylinder will last 13 hours for one pilot. The Malaysian investigation report states clearly that there were 2 flight crew oxygen cylinders, which is sufficient for one pilot for almost 27 hours. So if there were 2 pilots in the cockpit, then still enough for 13 hours, which is far more than the 7-hour, 37-minute flight.
Yeah, so oxygen was not an issue.
No.
So Robert Richardson, 6464, when the transponder went off, did it just go plink? Any attempt to change the numbers to 7600 or 7700?
Yeah, another commenter pointed out that I got the codes wrong, the wrong way round, and it's probably a good thing because actually we're not trying to do YouTube training videos for potential hijackers. So if a hijacker puts in 7,500 or 7,700 or something else, and gets that wrong and indicates it's not a hijack but an emergency. And by the way, I'm not going to tell you what the codes are again. You can go
Mm.
back and dig it out yourself from previous episodes. Um, there were 3,584 transponder transmissions captured by the official ADS-B receiver at Terengganu Airport between 16:49:39 UTC, around 7 minutes after takeoff, and 17:20:34 UTC, just before diversion. Um, Most importantly, to answer your question, the transponder didn't transmit any code other than 2157, which is the code assigned for MH370, until it stopped transmitting. The transponder's last two transmissions, however, were without altitude data. They were all with longitude and latitude, and nearly all of them with altitude data, but the last two weren't, and that shows that the switch in the cockpit was used which goes through a position of not transmitting altitude data and then going to standby and not transmitting any data. So if it had been a failure, and bearing in mind there are two transponders, so both would have to fail, then it would have just simply gone plink, as you say, and stopped transmitting altogether.
Again, it's a tiny piece, but it tells you something, doesn't it?
It does indeed.
So Doreen Lindner, 2579, in one of your previous videos, you mentioned that since 1945, only 81 planes have disappeared, went missing. I didn't know about that, besides from Amelia Earhart. Can I suggest another episode focusing on this special topic? Surely quite interesting stuff. Love watching your videos from Germany and hope the biggest mystery of modern aviation is soon to be solved. Thank you, Jeffrey Thomas, and vielen Dank, Richard Godfrey.
Yeah, vielen Dank, Doreen. The 81 planes who've disappeared since 1945 is, of course, 81 too many.
Yes.
But it is a nice idea to do an overview of all of those incidents and see what they had in common or did not have in common. Amelia Earhart, of course, is a very interesting subject, but is prior to 1945. We have to go back even further in the history of missing aircraft. And we're thinking about doing an episode on Amelia Earhart at some point. So, yeah, nice idea, Doreen, and we will give it some thought.
We will. David Dooling, 5997. I'm still amazed that not a single shredded life preserver has been found since the crash of MH370. It makes me think they are still on board the plane.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, David, and whether all of the life vests are still in their containers under each seat is something we can find out if we find the wreckage. And if the wreckage is at least intact to the extent that we can identify any life vest containers. So, yeah, I'd be very interested to find out that answer when we find the wreckage.
Yes, and just for the viewers, the life vests in economy class are in a pouch, which is actually strapped with Velcro tape underneath the seat that you're sitting on. In business class and first class, they're usually again, in a pouch, but they're usually in a sort of a semi-locked panel, which you have to open and pull it out. So they're not something that sort of is easily accessible, but it's reasonably accessible, but not easily accessible. Bill Tracy, 8774, very polite episode, but I would say it looks 99% like a pilot diversion. It was 97% on the 15th of March 2014, when Prime Minister shockingly said that USA, Boeing, AIIB, Malaysia all agreed it was apparent deliberate diversion. Since then, much more info has been provided, and it all continues to support that announcement. We do face a conundrum of not finding the aircraft, which hiding the crash was apparently the strategy to achieve deniability. I do not know if the pilot realised the extreme extent of denial he would achieve. That might have been his biggest miscalculation. The reboot of SATCOM at the end of the flight was the second biggest mistake.
Yeah, well, the SATCOM reboots by itself simply when an APU comes online, and of course, there's no way of telling how much fuel is left in the fuel line when the main tanks are exhausted of fuel. But to answer the question, Bill, we're obviously trying to be polite, but our goal is not simply politeness. An aircraft crash is a very sensitive subject, and an apparent deliberate diversion is, of course, even more sensitive because then the question arises who was the perpetrator or perpetrators? As we pointed out, Captain Sahari Shah has been subject to enormous scrutiny. So we wanted to point out the 10 things we know for sure about Captain Sahari Shah and what we know for sure about MH370. But of course, there is then room for an enormous amount of speculation which has taken place about what we don't know or what's missing in the information set. So, yeah, we're not just trying to be polite, we are trying to investigate and find out, but we want to be very careful when we present evidence as factual that we really have got facts right and evidence to present which supports those facts.
Indeed, we do. In fact, we spend a lot of time, particularly yourself, obviously, Richard, and myself, and I've been reporting on this terrible tragedy from the very night it happened. I was in New York, and I've been commenting on it ever since, with people like CNN, the BBC, Channel News Asia, Bloomberg, Al Jazeera, and others. And you know, to just report the facts is just so important because it is so incredibly sensitive, and it is an extraordinary crash, and it's an extraordinary disappearance. It's unprecedented in modern times. We've had nothing like it, and it raises so many questions, does it not, Richard?
Yeah, so we have questions which are of concern to the over 10 million of us who get on a plane every day and safety of the flying public. There are questions which the aviation industry are concerned about because they want to have a good track record. There are questions the MH370 families are concerned about because for them they've lost loved ones and they are trying to find some form of closure, which is very difficult. And then you got all of this misinformation and speculation and 150 books with different theories, and they can't all be right. And then you get the documentaries, you mentioned CNN and BBC and 60 Minutes Australia and on and on and on. Sky News, they've all got a different view and a different input. So it can be a very confusing subject, but there's a lot of interest. And so we have to continue until we get the answers.
I would suggest, and I've been covering aviation now for 50 years on and off, I would suggest there's been more written about MH370 than probably all air crashes combined since the war. I've never seen anything like it. And I can certainly say there's been more misinformation written about this crash than all crashes combined that I've in the last 50 years. No question whatsoever. And it's and the poor families have been torn to pieces by the speculation, and some of the things that have been said are just quite simply utterly ridiculous, and they just tear the poor relatives that are left behind to pieces. So it's a tough
Yeah,
one, Richard, isn't it not?
it is a very tough one, and we do not make any claim that we always get it right.
Mm.
So we invite comments and questions uh, and put us right when we make an error um, in what we're saying and presenting. So, yes, we can also make a mistake. So keep checking on us.
Yeah, please do. Don't check too carefully into what I say, but so but viewers, look, thank you very
But
much.
but of course, we've got the excuse we can always take the dog for a walk.
We did. Well, yes, and somebody wants me to show a picture of the dog, so I'll have to do that. So, look, viewers, thank you very much indeed for tuning in. Thank you very much for your support. Please subscribe to us. Please like us. Please keep those comments coming. And tune in tomorrow because tomorrow Richard's going to be examining KA007, which was shot down by the Russians. No argument about that. And MH17 that was also shot down by the Russians. No argument about that either. And that will be a fascinating episode tomorrow. And once again, Richard, thank you for all your work on this. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome.